All right, everybody have fun. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion about carbon markets after the COP27. Is the VCM emerging, growing, and maturing? This panel is hosted by the European Carbon Offset Tokenization Association. In short, it's ECOTA. We are a think tank connecting bright minds like our panelists Haley, Samuel, Ben, and Alistair on topics in and around regenerative finance. And we want to provide you in the audience with the best possible education about this young and vibrant industry. At ECOTA, we are passionate about the intersection of sustainability and blockchain technology, and we want to use this combination to achieve a net zero future for our planet. Panels like these are made possible by our trusted institutional members. These are organizations like Void and Partners, for example. Thank you very much for supporting this panel. I'm Max, one of the two executive directors of ECOTA, and I'm your moderator for this evening. But before we dive into today's topic, I want you to meet our panelists here. And maybe, Haley, let's start with you. You are the Chief Marketing Officer at Tallo. Maybe you tell us a bit about what you're doing and why you are passionate about regenerative finance.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Max. So I come with a sustainability background, not at all a blockchain or Web3 background. Though now that I've been in it for about a year and a half, I understand that means I'm like a grandmother in the industry. But yes, so I've spent about 15 years in climate and sustainability, starting with a degree in environmental science. I worked for a long time in the climate communication space. And our team is both folks who have my type of background on sustainability, and then also folks who have more of a blockchain and tech background. And what we're building is a platform to allow businesses and individuals to buy, sell, trade, and retire carbon credits. All of this is based on blockchain technology, and that's for a few key reasons. One is around transparency and traceability so that the buyers know what they're buying. The other is around efficiency, so cutting out intermediaries in the market, which we recently did a report that showed that intermediaries took about 15% of the total market value in 2021. And then for programmability, that allows us to do things like send royalty payments back to project developers for secondary trades on the platform. So I'm super excited about regenerative finance, refi as we're calling it, because having been in the sustainability sector for so long, I'm really seeing this influx of people with different types of backgrounds, finance backgrounds, tech backgrounds. And I think it's really what we need to solve a global problem at the scale of the climate crisis. So it's very, very exciting to see all of this talent coming into the industry and makes me really optimistic.
Thanks for joining, Haley. Maybe Samuel, you can go next.
Yes, thank you. This is Samuel from Climate Coin, where I lead the strategy. We are a group of financial experts from the climate finance and also blockchain space. I myself come also from sustainability space, where I worked at CDP, Korea, and COSIF for about 3.5 years, where I was involved with the ESG mandatory reporting, public procurement, and also corporate renewable electricity procurement. So I was exposed to how the demands I was taking fold through initiatives like RE100, SBTI, AB100, and also PCAF, which is the reason based on which financial institutions measure their financed emissions. At Climate Coins, personally, I am. Although I did not come from blockchain space, I was exposed to the crypto space from 2016. And the reason I joined Climate Coin is I want to relieve that my first interaction with DeFi protocol called MakerDAO. I want to relieve that experience to farmers and decarbonization project owners. And I see Climate Coin becoming a bridge for that. So at Climate Coin, we bring off-chain credits on-chain. But they also, at the same time, the reason we have partnerships with international government organizations like GCOMS, FLACMA, and also the CARICOM Secretariat is that we want to also implement bringing carbon offsets, implement ETMO idea through blockchain. So I think we share the same zeal and also passion. Over to you, Max.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today, Samuel. Alistair, you can go next.
Thanks, Max. So I'm Alistair Ware. I'm Director of Digital Climate Markets at IETA, which is an industry body for carbon markets. My background is actually more on the commodity side. So I spent a decade as a physical energy and agricultural commodity trader, and was looking for a new challenge, and started reading into kind of carbon markets back in 2018, 2019, and joined IETA just about a year and a half ago. And my focus there was really on kind of scaling the voluntary market. And I arrived just as the kind of refi movement was kicking off, and started kind of tracking the role that Toucan and others were playing in kind of bringing credits on chain, and was kind of deeply fascinated by the benefits that could potentially bring. And so that led to IETA launching its Digital Climate Markets Task Force, which has grown to be kind of one of the more followed working groups within IETA. Separately to that, we, as IETA, have been working very closely with the World Bank and the government of Singapore over the last few years. And 2 weeks ago, launched something called the Climate Action Data Trust, which is a spin-off of the Climate Warehouse, which is a metadata layer for carbon markets, leveraging blockchain, so connecting independent and national registries together to create a single source of truth via a data model that aggregates and harmonizes data from all these disparate registries. And then going forward, building on that to develop on-chain registries for governments as part of the Climate Warehouse program and the PMI. So thoroughly enjoying this kind of journey into both blockchain and carbon markets. Maybe I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks for being with us today. And Ben, last but not least.
Definitely not least. My name is Ben. I'm the head of sustainability at Return Protocol. And we're trying to incentivize people to offset their carbon footprint through social proof, and trying to incentivize them to like do it because they think it's cool. I have a traditionally finance background. I worked at BlackRock for about a year. I worked in valuations before that. But after the pandemic, I thought, maybe my talents would be better suited towards something less pushing numbers around, more something with respect to the climate. So I got a master's degree from Johns Hopkins in energy policy and climate. And I wrote my thesis on, or I guess it was a capstone project on voluntary carbon markets and how you can combine them with blockchain. So I've been pretty interested in the whole sector for quite a bit of time. I got into crypto sometime in 2019, actually through my sister, who was doing some stuff at Northwestern there, and I was helping her out. But yeah, I think the thing that really interests me is the incentive structures more than anything. Being able to get people to do certain things by offering the reward. I've always been sort of interested in that on the finance side. And so applying that to climate change is, I think, kind of one of the most important things that we can probably do in terms of solving climate change. So that's kind of my interest in voluntary carbon markets in general.
Thanks, Ben. And a big thanks to your sister actually bringing you to the space so that we can talk today. So
yeah, I'll thank her.
All right, thanks everyone for the introduction. Now let's get into today's topic. And we called this panel the voluntary carbon market after the COP27, but I think it's really more than that. We want to wrap out our year at ECOTA. We want to wrap out our year 2022 with this panel. And at least for us, it's been a hell of a ride. It's more but still, the voluntary carbon market, it's currently just a $2 billion small market. So from my perspective, the demand is very high. It's sky high, actually. But trusted and scalable solution, they are few and far in between. And I want to place back to you, Haley. If I'm not mistaken, you were at the COP27. So from your perspective, what have been sort of like the main developments in the voluntary carbon market that you saw in 2022, and were they discussed at all in Sharm El-Sheikh?
Yeah, thanks. So I did have the opportunity to be at COP27, which was hectic and wild and exciting and overwhelming. I think from a voluntary carbon market perspective, there was not a ton that came out of the negotiations themselves. Not, there's sort of a little bit of additional clarity on Article 6 and corresponding adjustments and kind of what role countries will play in terms of the voluntary carbon markets. But there wasn't sort of a final decision on anything. So there remains some kind of some lack of clarity there that will have an effect on the market going forward. In terms of the overall things that I've seen over the last year in the carbon markets, I would say I've remarked sort of three areas that there have been big developments. One is around corporate demand. So this has traditionally been the biggest driver of the voluntary carbon markets. And there have been several initiatives that have tried to give additional education and clarity around what companies should be doing with respect to using carbon offsets, what claims they can make. Two of the big ones are around the ICVCM. They drafted their core carbon principles. So this came out of the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. This is more on the supply side, but it's essentially determining what constitutes a sort of base carbon credit and what standards adhere to those. So we've drafted core carbon principles out. The finalized version will be out early next year. The other piece is around the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, a lot of acronyms here, but the VCMI. And that essentially has issued a draft claims code of practice, which is for companies to decide how, or for companies to understand what claims they can make based on having purchased certain types of carbon credits. So again, once there's more clarity around that, I see those as big drivers of crystallizing corporate demand. There's also the Science-Based Targets Initiative has issued some guidance as well. Also on the corporate demand front, I think we're seeing a lot more focus and interest in carbon removals, where obviously there's a difference between carbon avoidance projects and carbon removals projects. There was the big effort from Stripe and Shopify, the Frontier climate effort, to essentially inject a large amount of capital into the carbon removal space to start scaling up those types of carbon credits, which currently constitute about 3% of the market. But the understanding from a scientific perspective is it must be a much larger percentage. The second area is around diversification of demand. So seeing a lot more players coming into the space. Even with the market slowdown, we're seeing more investors coming in and looking at carbon credits as an asset class. Recently, TPG just launched a fund around carbon credits. Also seeing interest from Web3 protocols for things like return, trying to tap into new sources of demand, and particularly retail demand, which again, very, very small percentage of the market so far, but poised to potentially grow quite a lot. And then the third area is probably most relevant for this panel, which is around the digitization and tokenization of carbon credits. There are lots of groups that are working in the digital MRV space, so monitoring, reporting, and verification, to figure out how to make that whole process more efficient and speedier and cheaper so that more projects can come online faster. And then on the tokenization front, which is essentially bringing carbon credits from a carbon registry onto the blockchain through turning it into a token, essentially, we've seen a lot of interest from organizations like Vera and Gold Standard and American Carbon Registry on figuring out how they will allow for this to happen. Will they go a native tokenization route where they're issuing their own tokens? Will they work through a two-way bridge like what Fallow has launched with a registry out of Colombia called Biocarbon Registry? Will they go another route? So they've done a lot of public consultations in that area, and I think we're poised to see some clarity in that regard going forward at the beginning, hopefully towards the beginning of 2023.
Thank you. And I want to pose the same question to you, Alistair, but can maybe Haley mentioned this Article 6, and maybe for our listeners who don't know Article 6 as a word, maybe you can give us a primer on why it's so important for us and why it's discussed at sort of like these events. And then you can talk about what you are passionate about or what you learned in 2022 and what your experience was, if that matches the mood at COP27.
Sure. So I guess building on what Haley said, we didn't see a great deal of news coming out of COP. That wasn't necessarily unexpected. This was always envisioned to be what we define as kind of an implementation COP more than an ambition COP. So I mean, we took the kind of quantum leap forwards at Glasgow. And I think the reality was that we always expected Sharm El-Sheikh to be a much more detailed implementation type COP. And we saw both progress on 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. I mean, the reason why I think the world is very excited around this is this is the way that governments interact with carbon. And as we see going forwards, I think a lot more of the focus will be through kind of both 6.2 and 6.4, where governments are really driving the way. And will likely probably supersede the VCM relatively quickly in terms of scale and ambition. And I think what's interesting is actually we're kind of there. I mean, we don't really need to wait until Dubai for countries to start transacting. And so we've seen a lot of announcements at COP. The likes of Switzerland and Thailand, Singapore was particularly active in terms of announcing MOUs with a number of different countries. And so over the course of the next year, I think we're going to continue to see this sort of gradual build-up of both ambition in terms of the infrastructure. And so I think going forwards over the next year, one of the things the UNFCCC has to work out is what the kind of infrastructure looks like for this implementation in terms of how they track the issuance of IDMOs. And that may or may not be blockchain based. I think all of us here on the panel would be very keen for that to be built on the blockchain. And I know that the UNFCCC has been very actively following the developments. If we look at the Climate Warehouse, which is this metadata layer based on the blockchain, UNFCCC was probably the most active observer of this platform and will continue to be an observer. So they're really getting a good feel for kind of what the technology provides and what it can do. I mean, outside of that, I think continuing on this sort of implementation, I'm very excited for next year, where we really just move forwards. I'm hoping that we'll see a number of pilots from both independent standards and national registries around tokenization. And I'm sure we'll see efforts to try native tokenization. I'm sure that third-party bridges, the likes of Thallo, that have been built out with a number of registries will gain traction. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the broader market adopts tokenization. I mean, we've seen that Toucan was very successful at the back part of 2021, bringing 20 million tons approximately of carbon on chain. That kind of went into hiatus over the last year, but hopefully it'll continue on in 2023. So yeah, I think across the board, I'm very excited for a number of kind of Web3 initiatives that are leveraging blockchain.
And just for context, for the audience here, Dubai is going to be the next COP in the next year. Just to let you know. And I saw you, Samuel. I saw you nodding a lot. So is this something that you are also thinking about, or what is your review of the event in Egypt?
Yes, although I was not myself at the COP27, Javier and Jose from our team was present, and I think definitely, I think for the first time in COP history, there was a high level interest on the possibility that blockchain presents, starting with the showcase of Project Genesis conducted by VIS, and where Goldman Sachs also participated. But what also where a large part of ReFi committees were present. But myself, based in South Korea, maybe I can share some light on what COP27 has the implications it had for the internal conversations in South Korea. I really think that we are living in an era of ICO instead of this time the initial carbon offering, where because following the commitments from companies and countries, especially from companies, they have now done the math of how many costs it will be involved to implement, to carry out those commitments, and have started internally on actually creating launching their own standard. So it is an open news that one of the large companies in Korea called SK has launched its own carbon standard, and has started investigating on the new methodologies that it can implement. In some sense, I feel that this is what I've also heard, that this is also witnessed also in other countries, and I think for the next year we're actually going to see a new players step in and strive to earn a reputation, and in that regard, I think that it resembles the ICO from crypto space in 2016, where we saw a lot of new players and gradually fighting in its own positions. Also, it has an implication for the compliance market in Korea, which limited the import of foreign credits at 5%, with the rising interest on VCM, the authorities have embarked on an open consultation on how VCM they can tap into the VCM market to complement their existing compliance market. I did laugh a lot, Max, because I think that coming from Web 2, where I saw the conversation on carbon credits formulate from mostly on the demand side from SBTi, VCMI, and whatnot, RE100. I saw an interesting play at Web 3 with the suppliers of carbon credits, or the bridges themselves, convene together and work towards an open goal to provide a coherent data to the end user in the absence of a user. So that's, I think, has been one of the most interesting facts for me personally, and that's my take of COP27.
And I love your analogy to the ICO mania that we have earlier in crypto, but let's hope that the outcome resembles a different outcome than the ICO mania we already had in this space. Just to be sure about this. And Ben, I want to pose the same question to you, but maybe you can rely on your answer a bit, or focus a bit more on what Samuel already hinted on, and what I wanted to talk about in this panel also later on, which is institutional adoption. What did you take away from COP27 for like transparency, all of the things that Samuel just mentioned? So transparency, data integrity, and all of this. What is your takeaway on that front?
So I'm not sure how much COP27 has jurisdiction over voluntary carbon markets in general. I will say that obviously the decisions that are made there at the international level do trickle down into some decision making that you see on regional levels. Obviously, it's going to be very different depending on the region and the jurisdiction. I mean, South Korea has a very different structure than the United States. And here at like a federal level versus a state level, I mean, it'd be completely different in terms of how we're going to start reporting things, regulating things, and things like that. For corporates, especially, I think that you've got two different kinds of company. You've got companies that care about, obviously, it's going to be very different depending on the region. And sorry, did I just have an echo?
No, so
my bad. Okay. Yeah, so two kinds of companies. You've got corporations that, you know, have a strategy of actually greenwashing and not really caring or doing anything. And you've got corporations that, you know, to some degree, you know, are trying to create some sort of, you know, real corporate commitment. You kind of see that with Frontier. And for them, you know, transparency is really important. They really want to know where their credits are coming from. You know, is this fraudulent? Is this good? Does this have high integrity? And for the corporations that don't, really, you know, just want to skate by, they don't. And I think that when you look at the carbon credits that are currently on the market, you can sort of see which corporations are winning the battle right now. And it's mostly the ones that are greenwashing, unfortunately. And so I appreciate everyone's optimism, but based on what I've seen in terms of carbon credit integrity, I think we've got a really long way to go before I think our industry matures to the point where it's actually doing something to help the climate.
Yeah, I see this point, and I want to play this back to you, Haley. I wanted to talk about where is the growth in 2023 actually coming from? Is it from Web 2 companies? Ben just mentioned that some of them greenwash, but there can be growth in greenwashing, right? So is it the Web 2 companies who realize, oh, there is a new technology which gives us some benefits in these topics of transparency, for example, or data integrity? Or is it Web 3 use cases in like incorporating carbon credits into DeFi, for example, and getting a carbon-backed loan? And where do you see the growth from coming in 2023?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think Ben, it's an important distinction you make, that some of the demand has been very educated demand, and some has been, you know, if we give a benefit of the doubt, maybe it's just less educated demand in terms of what quality is. And it's quite hard to determine what quality is in the voluntary carbon markets. Some things are very obvious. if there's no data about the community that a project is located in, then probably they're not doing very well by the community. But oftentimes it's very hard to make a trade-off and say, is a Ugandan cook stove project higher quality than an afforestation project in Colombia? Who's to say? It probably comes down to your corporate commitments. But in terms of where the growth will be in 2023, so the vast majority of the demand up to till now has been from the Web 2 community. So large corporates, for the most part, have really driven demand. I think we're starting to see that transition to having more demand come from things like DeFi protocols that want to back their stablecoins, for instance, with real world assets and want to use carbon credits to do that. I think 2023 will be a transition year in that regard, but I do think the bulk will continue to come from those Web 2 companies. And that's really why, you're seeing a proliferation of different types of approaches for how to bring more data to the ultimate buyer of the carbon credit, more access, more ways of generating carbon credits. But we're very much taking the stand that if this market is going to expand the way it needs to expand, we need to have blockchain or carbon credits on blockchain be accessible to those Web 2 companies. It has to be that you can buy a blockchain-backed carbon credit without having to open a wallet, because that is a big barrier and will be a barrier for both individuals and for companies. So our platform is really kind of intuitive and looks very Web 2, and the blockchain piece is on the back end. I think what we'll see over time is there's a greater transition as more folks have wallets, as more folks are comfortable with blockchain technology and recognize its benefits. And as, quite honestly, some of that is as the crypto markets start to get a better reputation, because right now the reputation is not very good, then we'll start to see more uptake from those other sort of Web3 native demand. But again, I think it'll remain Web 2, at least for the majority of next year. And I think it has to be attractive to Web 2 companies in order to continue to scale with integrity.
Yeah. And Alistair, I want to ask you this: if most of the demand will be coming from Web 2 companies, and you work for an organization that is very experienced with so that legacy players, let's put it like this. I'm a blockchain native, so excuse my my terminology here. But what does that mean for our industry? What do we need to value the most if we want to target these Web 2 companies that are so crucial for scaling this market?
So I think the thing we need to recognize is historically these companies move relatively slowly. And so they'll kind of dip their toe in the water and see how that works, and then gradually scale up their involvement in kind of Web3 and tokenized carbon credits. I think what's really interesting is actually we're seeing a lot of startups focus on tracking of supply chain emissions, which is clearly critical to heavy industry. And there's lots of work around tokenization of carbon emissions. IW has done a great job in terms of developing its carbon emissions token. And so the idea that you can track your emissions on the blockchain through the supply chain and then start wrapping carbon credits with those emissions, I think is really exciting. And so looking forwards, allowing for corporates to really accurately track their emissions down to a product or service level, I think is going to be a big driver of demand for tokenized carbon credits going forwards. But I think we have to recognize that it's a slow journey, both in terms of we don't have the regulation and this technology is so nascent. So I just hope that 2023 will continue to grow and we see some sort of widespread adoption.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, building this bridge to you, because you started this topic, is transparency the one-fits-all solution for this, or do you see something else that we have to work on?
It's not. Transparency is an issue, definitely, but I think like fundamentally at its core, I'm a little worried that the voluntary carbon market is like losing sight of its purpose. Like the entire point of this marketplace is to incentivize people to like remove or prevent carbon dioxide from going to the atmosphere. And although, and I know I might get some flack for this, but I don't think tying like UN development goals to carbon credits necessarily does us any good. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing to like do UN sustainability goals, like don't get me wrong, or development goals, but to receive a carbon credit, like helping a community is great, conservation is great, but have you actually taken carbon out of the atmosphere? Have you actually done anything to prevent it from going into the atmosphere? And if we judge a carbon credit's quality based on these co-benefits, instead of like it's actually doing the thing that it's supposed to do, we start basically letting businesses get away with claiming that they've got emission reductions, when in fact what they've done is they've helped the community instead. That's great on an ESG report, but it's not actually doing the thing that they need to be doing. And the other thing too is that when you look at the cost differences between, most of the credits that are associated with like these development goals, they're avoidance projects. There's, you could say there's two kinds: there's removal and there's avoidance. And these avoidance ones are just so much cheaper and issued with so much higher volume than the removal ones. And it's like you can clearly see that like businesses are like, well, we're going to justify buying these avoidance ones because they're really cheap. And, if you're a company like Airbus, right, they had, I think, 465 million tons of CO2 equivalents. That's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions just in 2021. If they spent all that on removal credits, like those $200 DAC credits, there's enough capacity for DAC yet, but let's just say they had. I mean, that's $100 billion. That's bigger than their entire market capitalization. Obviously, it doesn't make sense for them to do that. They do need to be buying these like cheaper credits. But if those cheap credits have no real benefit attached to them, like in terms of reducing emissions, then what's the point? I think honestly, what we should start doing is segmenting the market, where like, if you want to support conservation, great, get a conservation credit. If you want to support, some sort of development goal, fantastic, get the credit associated with that. But you don't get to like invest in buy a renewable energy credit or an avoidance credit based on renewable energy and then claim meaningful emission reduction. And so I think like bottom line, the big problem is that we haven't really defined what you should actually get a carbon credit for. And that's created a lot of market fragmentation. And you've got these two camps then. You've got the corporates that like are, in my opinion, greenwashing, and you've got corporates, whether they're well-intentioned or not. And then you've got corporates that are very much like investing in frontier and trying to get, DACs, enhanced weathering, enhanced mineralization off the ground, because they see that as like a real, like impactful solution to actually stopping, reversing climate change. So I think that's where we need to, all of our focus should be really going before we even talk about things like transparency. Although, again, transparency is an issue for sure.
And before I play this back to Haley, because I'm sure she has a different perspective on that, I want to ask Samuel actually a question. You have climate and coin in your name, and you talked about the ICO of initial carbon offering. Now we talked about, okay, there are maybe some, I had a panel last week, I think, where someone called them cowboys. Let's call them cowboys. There are some cowboys in the market who maybe are not 100% aligned with what we think about integrity and actually doing something good for the planet. How can we combine these two moves that we see in the market?
So actually, I do not necessarily label cowboys as a bad thing, because I think it's a symptom that more attention is being drawn upon to VCM. And I think that's where I see the efforts of Return Protocol is really valuable, because no, maybe I should start with this. I think the VCM itself has its role when it is trading at a higher price, because that provides a market that provides a basis for internal decision-making process within companies, and that's called internal carbon price. So be it removal, be it avoidance, before all that, just like on a macro level, let's discuss, when did people even pay attention to Bitcoin when it was trading at $100? But we do have people plugging in a mining machine at every household when it was trading at $20,000, right? And I think that's I would like to put a same rationale on voluntary carbon market. And I think that cowboys is a great sign, because even those that are not interested in the reduction and avoidance, all this thing, are now paying attention. And now that's why I think a higher priority should be placed on 2023 on defining what constitutes as a high quality. That may differ from Web 2 and Web 3. And just to add just one more, that's where I think Return Protocol is playing a role on defining that, and what I've seen RE100 do to companies and national governments in determining their strategy for renewable developments.
What about you, Haley? Do you share this perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ben, you made a lot of interesting points, and I respectfully disagree with most of them. And but I think that's why it's important to have these conversations. So I think, you know, your point about wanting the co-benefits of a carbon project, and this is, you know, things like benefits, economic benefits to a local community if it's a nature-based project, for instance. That you think those shouldn't be part of kind of determination of quality, and that it should just be whether or not the carbon is removed or avoided. I think what that comes down to is like whether or not there actually would be a market for just the co-benefits separately. What we have now is a voluntary carbon market where, specifically for avoidance, because that's 97% of the market right now, carbon credits that have these co-benefits go for a premium over ones that don't. So if you could separate it out and say, great, you have just the carbon, and then separately you have just the economic benefit, and you had different markets and it was a total commodities market, sure, maybe that would work. But I think in that case, even what you would do is you would then incentivize projects that maybe even hurt local communities just to get the carbon benefit of it, right? So I think that what you want to incentivize, what we are trying to incentivize, and our focus is very much on project developers, and we spend, you know, every day talking to them. We are trying to incentivize high quality projects to get made. And for us, that means projects that benefit the local landowners, that are certain that the project developer has consulted with and has an agreement in place with whoever actually owns the land. If it's an indigenous community, they may not have formal land rights. So going through a process to get formal land rights, all of this. So I just think, you know, it would set us back too far to try to do a totally separate market for kind of like every piece of a carbon credit, biodiversity, community benefit, carbon, et cetera. And then I think the other piece is about this, and this is tough because I literally studied climate science. I have worked in this sector for 15 years, but I do very much think, based on what I have seen, that climate is a great example of not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And if there is a net benefit, even if it's not as much of a benefit as somebody is claiming, that's actually we need that. And so I say that in the context of maybe some avoidance credits aren't as good, or are not actually removing a whole ton of carbon credits. I've seen companies say, great, we don't know for sure if the carbon credits are as good as we want them to be, so we're going to buy double the amount that we need for our carbon footprint, or we're going to buy 1.5 times the amount to make up for this potential kind of miss there. But I think ultimately a net benefit is better than no benefit. And on the greenwashing front, I mean, the whole hope of the carbon market is that as voluntary or as carbon credits get more expensive, companies will sit there and they'll say, it's going to cost us $1 billion to buy carbon credits. What if we do a quick NPV analysis and look at what we can do for $1 billion in our own supply chain? Actually, we're going to overhaul all of our operations, and we're going to, you know, just deal with our scope 2 emissions and procure renewable electricity for all of our operations, for instance. So I think there's all these incentives at play, and it's so tough and so complicated, but I do think that this market can reach the ultimate goal, which is to have a net benefit in terms of carbon emissions. So I do disagree a little bit with like what the perfect version of this market looks like from where we are now. If we were starting it all over and we're 20 years ago and we could design it in any way, I think we're probably all in agreement that we wouldn't design it the way that it's currently designed. But where we are now, I think we have to be realists about what's possible going forward in the time frame that we have.
So before I bring Alistair from a neutral point of view into this conversation, Ben, is everything all right now? Everything?
I think I have a few things I'd like to say about that. I don't, you know, I understand the sentiment. But I mean, to your last point, like if we were going to do it all over again, you know, Web3 is, I think, in some ways, maybe an opportunity to sort of do it over again. I mean, the market is only 2 billion in volume. That's not huge. And I mean, a sunk cost is hard to swallow, but I think this is one of those markets where, like, we can't fail here. like failure here is, you know, we create so many more problems in the future. And so I think it's worth, I think, doing that extra work to, you know, really, you know, try to make sure that our foundation is strong. Because if we're just building on this sort of foundation of quicksand, in the future, things are not going to be great. And if you look at like standards like Vera and Gold Standard, I mean, those are the two biggest in the market. And this will be quick. If you look at their incentives right now, you know, they make money charging a levy on issuance, not retirement, not sale. They don't care about quality. It's just issuance. And so whether you think, and by no means do I think that anyone over there is like a bad person. I think they're all very well intentioned. They're nice people. But the problem is that, you know, they went from making, you know, something like $6 million in revenue back in 2017, 2018, and now they make $40 million. And 90% of that is coming from carbon credit issuance. And if you look at the projects that issue the most credits, all of them are like those avoidance-based renewable energy projects. All of them are those avoidance-based nature-based solutions. And if you look at B0 Carbon, at least, which is that, you know, big rating company that we have, and you look at the carbon credits that get consistently the lowest ratings, those are the ones. And like when you have an incentive structure that like basically says like, this is the thing that we're going to do, they can't change that moving forward because they have payroll. They have people that need to rely on that income that they make. They got to fire a bunch of people then and then restart and try a different kind of revenue model. And so my worry here is like, yeah, you're right. We shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But I'd say that like, I don't think we've reached good yet. I don't think that we're at that level. I think that there's a lot of work before we can even say that we're good. And I think if you go off just the rating companies themselves, they'll say that like the majority credits in the market are bad. And I don't think it's asking too much for us to like be like, look, we should do significantly more in terms of like calibrating the incentives so that people are, you know, buying what makes sense, actually registering projects that make sense. And then from there, you know, costs, dealing with that, I think regulation will play a big role in how these markets are run. And, you know, we don't have to reinvent the whole wheel, but I think we should definitely look into fixing some parts of it, like deep ingrained flaws in it.
All right, I see 45 minutes is way too short of a period to actually talk through this. But Alistair, give me your take on this. What do you see in the market?
Sure. So I mean, I think that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that voluntary carbon market is, as its name dictates, voluntary. We have a compliance market. We have the likes of EU ETS, which are purely focused on carbon. But if you look at the voluntary carbon market today, we've got 170 odd different project types that will allow you to issue a carbon credit. And that exists because corporates want this diversity of project type. There are corporates that care uniquely about carbon, and then they'll probably go and buy some sort of DAC or take removal. There are equally corporates that care about SDGs or care about biodiversity over, let's say, the embedded carbon within that credit. And I think there's room for all of these things to scale. There's room for removals to scale. There's room for afforestation to scale. There's room for biodiversity to scale. I think what's really important is actually defining what good looks like and making sure that credits that claim to have a specific impact actually have that impact. That means, okay, looking at the baselines and really working out, does this project sequester X tons of carbon within its life? And that's where the rating agency comes in. But if you look at the ratings agencies today, a B0 rating and a Silvera rating for the same credit can be very different. And so we're very nascent. We're at this immature moment where we haven't got collectively a consensus in terms of what a good credit looks like. We don't perhaps even have the technologies that we need to assess credits correctly, but we're addressing all of those issues pretty quickly. And I think my hope is that both voluntary markets grow, but also compliance markets grow. Clearly, the climate crisis is something that affects all of us. And there's no room for kind of picking and choosing portions of the market. Everything needs to scale substantially for us to meet any sort of 2030 or 2050 goals. I mean, I'll leave it at that.
All right, and let's end the discussion about this here, because I see that we're already at our targeted time. But I want to give you one more minute, each of you, to talk about what you are excited in 2023. Maybe keeping our discussion here in mind and like thinking about data integrity and carbon ratings. Or what is the thing that you are most excited about in the upcoming year? And I want to start with you, Sam. Maybe you can give me your take on what you are most interested in 2023.
Yeah. What I'm most excited about is the exposure of the so-called Web2 stakeholders to what's possible in the crypto space. That could be an NFT, that could be lending borrowing protocol, but once they realize these, I think we're also going to see a lot of activities on chain. And that's what I'm mostly interested in.
All right, Ben, what about you?
I like a lot of the development that's happening in CDR, carbon dioxide removal. So there's a lot of pilot programs out there that are trying to make sure that they can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. It's obviously really nascent. There's a lot of growth that needs to happen there, but I think every year new and more exciting things come out. So that's always something that I like to look at.
Haley, what is your 2023 looking like?
Yeah, I'm very excited that we're having all these types of discussions. And to me, it's an indication that there's more interest in this market. There are new folks on the demand side interested in carbon credits who have never looked at them before. There are new project types coming up, new project methodologies from new project developers that have never been in this market before. So to me, I'm excited to have more companies, more individuals, more brains in the voluntary carbon market space, because I think the more attention there is, the more we solve some of these foundational problems and challenges that we're facing now. So I think that's going to be a big part of 2023, and I'm excited about that.
Alistair, what are you excited about?
I think I'm going to echo Haley's sentiment and say that I'm just looking forward to more brains coming into the industry, more experimentation, more pilots, more kind of fresh thinking in terms of how we can scale this. It's amazing how many people have entered the market over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think we're on this kind of exponential growth of really exciting developments and minds coming into the marketplace.
All right, then Haley, Sam, Ben, Alistair, thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a great year for ECOTA. We were founded this year, and I think you get, so at least for me as a moderator, yeah, I get the feeling that this space is one of the most vibrant and you can work in. So it's a very, very pleasant talk. Thank you all for being with us today. And for all of you in the audience, thank you for taking your time and watching this panel today. I wish you all happy holidays and a good ending to your 2022. And I'm looking forward to see you in 2023. Have a great holiday. See you around. Bye-bye.